So I'm trying to make a strong case, although, like I said, I probably don't need to convince any of you that the sense of smell is important for our health span, our lifespan, and our quality of life. So just beginning, as you all know, odors are chemicals and they have specific properties in order for us to be able to smell them. So not every chemical that is floating through the air can be smelled. And this is another point, that the chemicals that we are calling smells are those that are floating in the air. But very intriguingly, the actual chemicals that make up the air that we breathe, that keep us alive, such as oxygen and hydrogen and carbon dioxide and helium and so forth, are actually of a certain size and characteristic that we actually cannot detect them as smells. So something that I like to think about is that the air that we're breathing to sustain our existence is like a blank canvas, and all the other percepts that we experience as smells, the other chemicals that are floating in it, those are like the paints of our world that we are then appreciating as smells. So you can see, for example, on the top here, two chemicals we can smell. Menthol smells like mint. Isobutyl methylpyrazine smells like green pepper. And here are some examples of smells that, or rather, chemicals that we cannot smell, but they are part of the air that is around us. So moving along from that, I also want to let you know that the number of potential odorants, and by that I mean specific chemicals that have a olfactory property to them, that is to say that they are smellable, is extremely large. And the number has been a little bit of a moving target over the last 5 years or so. At one point, people were saying over 1 trillion. Now we're pulling back a little bit and saying 40 billion. But in any event, the idea is that it is vast and greater than our ability to detect stimuli in any of our other senses. And that's actually something which is really fantastic and interesting. We all think about vision as being so out there and primary, but actually we can detect more in the smellscape if we were ever capable of being presented with 40 billion odorants. So another thing that you may already know from earlier today is that there are two modes of smelling. And the typical one that we think of is when we inhale through our nostrils, and that is the sort of orthonasal version of it. But there's also a very important version that is very important for the experience of quality of life connected to smell, and that is the ability to smell while we have food in our mouth. And that is because we have the capability of air moving through our mouth and then actually going up through an airway passage in the back of our mouth and getting up into the nose and going to the same place. This is where all smells are detected. And it can either come from inhaling through our nostrils or through the back of our mouth. The chemicals then land on this patch of sensory neuron tissue, and here the biochemical processes take place that enable us to start the cascade of conscious olfactory perception. But so this important feature of being able to smell through our mouth is extremely important for what we consider the sense of taste and our experience of food. And it is very importantly based on the fact that we're breathing at the same time as we are eating. So we inhale, and that is bringing various odor molecules up from the back of the mouth through to the nose and onto this patch of epithelium. And then the exhalation allows this airway to whoosh through and actually stimulate those receptors and give us the full-blown sensation of smell. And having an open airway system from the mouth to the nose is also actually what has allowed the evolution of language in humans. So humans are defined as having the ability to have complex spoken language as a unique feature, and also as being able to experience flavor as a unique feature of being human. So as you probably are well aware of, people tend to say the word taste all the time when they are referring to the experience of eating, but really mostly what they're talking about is flavor. And just to sort of give you guys the background here, taste is actually a very simple system. From the point of view of basic perception, there's really only probably 5 sensations that are being perceived: salt, sour, sweet, bitter, and umami. But everything else that we are experiencing when we are eating food comes from that taste experience combined with a scent. So for example, we have the taste of salt combined with steak aroma, and there you have the perceptual experience of the charred grilled steak, which is so much more than just taste of salt. And so our experience of flavor is the fusion of taste with scent. So the grilled charred steak is the taste of salt plus the aroma of steak. The chocolate cake is the taste of sweet with the chocolate aroma, and so on. Now, as I'm sure many of you are extremely well aware, when we don't have aroma, we do not have flavor. So without this capability of perceiving that steak aroma, all we experience when we are eating that piece of steak, apart from the texture and so forth of what is in our mouth, is the taste of salt. And this is very disturbing and unfortunate. And many people with smell loss really, really struggle with this aspect of existence because the pleasure of food is so much involved in every aspect of our lives, not only with ourselves personally, but also sharing with others. So for any of you who don't realize this connection between taste and smell, there's a very simple test you can all do to sort of prove it to yourself, which is to take a flavored candy like a jelly bean, which regardless of the color, all actually taste the same sweetness, but the color is a signal actually for the flavor difference, which is different for each of them. And you plug your nostrils, you bite into one of these jelly beans, and all you taste is sweet. You release your nostrils and suddenly it's lime, it's lemon, it's cherry, it's licorice, and so forth. But another really interesting thing happens as well, and that is that the taste actually gets more intense. The jelly bean tastes sweeter when you can also smell. And this is because the senses of taste and smell really synergize together. So not only is it the case that the person who can't smell doesn't get any flavor experience, they're also getting a weaker taste perception than what they had before. So this is extremely difficult for people with smell loss to deal with and compensate for. So the overall idea that I'm making here is that your brain actually is what's responsible for making flavor. You have your nose involved in the aromatic aspect, you have your taste involved in the basic sensations, but your brain is then putting those two sensations together and producing this experience we call flavor, although most people say taste. And the reason people tend to say taste is because you have the food in your mouth, and we know that taste is in our mouth. So it's like a localization illusion, but it's really your brain and it's mostly your sense of smell. So with that said, sort of talking about the brain a little bit further, one of the really special things about our sense of smell is that it has a unique and privileged connection to the part of the brain where emotion, associations, and memory takes place. In fact, our conscious perception of a scent, so consciously recognizing I'm smelling pear right now, I'm smelling rose right now, is actually occurring in exactly the same part of the brain where emotion and memory is processed, the amygdala hippocampal complex. This structures combined here that are in the limbic system. And none of our other senses has this privileged direct connection. And this makes our experience of scent inherently, viscerally, emotionally, personally, associatively involving, unlike any of our other sensory experiences. So, as you know, anosmia is the inability to smell or smell blindness, and it is caused by a variety of different external factors, as well as potentially being born without a sense of smell. So the most common reason that people lose their sense of smell, and we're extremely aware of this now over the last 3 years from COVID, is through disease. So typically upper respiratory viral infections can produce smell loss, and often it's transient, but not always. And prior to COVID, it was the case that people had upper respiratory tract infections that left them without smell, for years and still to this day afterwards. We also have the issue of nasal polyps, which fortunately, if they are removed, our sense of smell comes back. So this is basically obstruction in the nose, not enabling the air that's containing all those wonderful smells to get up to the epithelium. There's also the issue of environmental toxins and medications. Depending upon the environment people work in, they could be exposed to toxins that are killing off those olfactory receptors, which in fact are directly exposed to the environment. There's no mediating barrier. And this is different from any of our other senses where there's a mediating barrier between the outside world and the inside world. For example, with vision, we have our cornea protecting the neurons that are allowing us to see from the world around us. In hearing, we have the eardrum and so forth. But in our sense of smell, it's directly out there. And that means that the environment and pollutants and so forth that are in it can kill off the neurons at a much higher rate than normally occurs. The good news there also is that when people get out of these toxic environments, their sense of smell regenerates and recovers. And likewise, also certain medications downregulate the olfactory capabilities, which when people get off those medications, they can recover as well. Now, another unfortunate area, which is typically permanent, but I think in the future may not be so much, is when people actually have traumatic injury and the olfactory nerve is in fact severed in the brain. So the connection between the nose and the brain is cut off. And typically that is a very difficult situation for regeneration to take place in. And most of the time, people who have that kind of injury tend not to be able to get their sense of smell back. But I think in the not too distant future, there will be mechanisms to rescue whatever might be still remaining and potentially bring back our sense of smell for individuals who have this kind of loss, as well as the issue of neural implants being available for this kind of loss. And then, of course, we have the slow, creep of time, which affects all of us. And just like with hearing and vision, although to very variable degrees, our sense of smell weakens as we age. We also have neurological disorders, which you probably just heard about, Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's being the primary ones, where smell loss precedes all the other symptoms by at times decades. And then most rare of all is congenital anosmia, being born without a sense of smell. So everything else I'm talking about is acquired anosmia. Congenital anosmia affects about 0.06% of the population. So relative to the other versions of smell loss is quite rare. So in terms of the rates of smell loss prior to COVID or COVID independent, it's estimated, and these numbers are certainly not hard and fast, but from the point of view of what is out there research and written, at least 2% of young adults and up to about 80% of adults over the age of 80 have at least olfactory dysfunction, if not entire smell loss. And now, as a function of COVID, there are at least 15 million people worldwide who are suffering from long-term smell loss or major dysfunction like parosmias as a result of long COVID symptoms relating to the sense of smell. Now, this being the case, you would think, actually, especially from COVID and all the media surrounding it, that people would actually value the sense of smell, but the American Medical Association puts it at only between 1 to 5% of a person's net life worth. This is to do with insurance cases and how much will we give the person who's lost their sense of smell in an accident, for example. And by contrast, just so you see this, vision is valued at 85% of your life's net worth. So smell is typically by the medical community, traditionally viewed as very, very unimportant. And likewise, so it is by the general public. And I'm going to tell you some results right now from a study where I collected data in the spring of 2021. So after a lot was known about COVID-related smell loss and the suffering that people were experiencing from it. But nevertheless, here you will see we had about 400 participants, about 200 participants in the college age category, and another 200 who are sort of general adults, I would call them, in the 40-something age category. And what we had them do was evaluate the value of losing their sense of smell compared to losing vision or hearing, and then also losing their sense of smell relative to various common commodities. 9 common commodities we had, from your cell phone to a dream vacation to your pet to your hair to your little toe, which was based on an earlier study where that was the only comparison point. But here are the latest results from that. And actually, this study has now been replicated with over 1,000 participants across 22 countries and 7 different languages. But that data isn't quite ready for this prime time yet. But in any case, the results are pretty much the same. Where in terms of having to give up the sense of smell versus hearing or vision, 85% would give up smell compared to the other 2 senses. 13% would give up hearing, only 2% would give up vision. And now we have the really fun data, which is, would you give up a commodity versus your sense of smell? And especially for college students, they really don't seem to care about their sense of smell. About 25% of college students would rather give up their sense of smell than their cell phone or $10,000. And 50% of them would rather give up their sense of smell than their hair, which, hair is something that I value too, as you might be able to see, but hair doesn't do anything for me other than aesthetically. If it's cold out, I can wear a hat if I didn't have hair. So this is really quite a stunning finding. So our sense of smell by the general public, even with COVID really making headlines, is still extremely undervalued and unappreciated. So one of the reasons for this, and I think probably one of the major reasons for this, is that odors are invisible and olfactory disorders are invisible as well. We don't see smells unless we say, oh, this is the smell, and look down and there's the flower, it must be coming from that. And olfactory disorders, someone can be with you, a colleague, a friend, and so on, and unless they tell you that they can't smell, you would have no idea, unlike other disabilities, which are all visible to varying degrees. So people who are suffering with a sense of smell go completely unnoticed by the general public, and the scent themselves that are not being perceived are also not visible. So this really makes a very big challenge to bring awareness to the importance of smell to people who have not had the experience of any kind of smell loss. So anosmia takes tremendous toll, as I'm sure you very well know. So as I already mentioned, the pleasure of food is a primary form of joy in our existence. It is something that we share socially. It's something that we experience privately. It's something that we experience probably a minimum of 3 times a day. And without a sense of smell, that pleasure is primarily gone. We can still get the pleasure of sweetness. We can get the pleasure of saltiness to varying degrees. We can get pleasure from creaminess, the texture sensation in our mouth, or crunchiness if we like that, and so on. But otherwise, our experience of food is really, really diminished. And this can be very difficult for people. So as I mentioned before, without smell, you're just maybe getting some vague connection to the idea that there was a steak there or there was chocolate cake there. But otherwise, it's gone. Another thing that tends to suffer along these same lines is when people lose their sense of smell, at least initially, their nutrition often suffers because they are not going for foods that are healthy, particularly. They're going for trying to get some of that pleasure back. So focusing a lot on salt, sugar, and fat. And not only is that not particularly healthy from the point of view of diet, but it can lead to a lot of weight fluctuations. So often what happens when people are first experiencing smell loss is they go through a lot of these fluctuations in weight where they're trying to get some of that pleasure back. So they're really overeating with respect to hedonically high foods that are really high in sugar, high in fat, and so forth, and therefore very high calorie. Then often they'll become completely despondent, not want to eat at all, and lose a lot of weight. And this kind of yo-yoing for weight is also unhealthy. And generally speaking, how it ends up sort of evening out is at a higher weight level than what people were prior to smell loss. There's also a big issue with respect to food safety. From the point of view, at least from data in the United States, the Centers for Disease Control says that about 3,000 people die every year from food poisoning. And I have heard firsthand from various people who have long-term smell loss from COVID that they have gotten food poisoning so much more often in the last year or two, that is, since they haven't been able to smell, than prior to. And fortunately, these people are still alive to tell me about it, but they have been very sick. This is food in the refrigerator. I just made it a couple of days ago. I'll eat it, but they get sick. Or they end up saying, you know what? Anything that I've just made, I don't know if it's going to be good. I'm going to throw it out. And that means that a lot of food waste is also accumulating. Home safety is also an issue. So carbon monoxide, which is from your gas appliances, does not have a natural smell that we can perceive, as you may have seen from the first slides. But the gas companies add a odorant to it so that people with a sense of smell can detect if there's a gas leak. But again, just from the point of view of data from the US, over 400 people every year die from accidental carbon monoxide poisoning. So this is an issue. And if you can't smell that it's there, then it's an ever more exponentially important issue. In terms of our physical health and our lifespan in and of itself, I'm sure you heard a lot about physical health in the last talk, but just from the point of view of our lifespan, people who are over the age of 55 who have lost their sense of smell are 4 times more likely to die within a 5-year period than their peers who have everything else held, in equivalence. So if you have whatever background you're from, other health conditions and so forth, still the people without a sense of smell are 4 times more likely to die than their same age peers. Here's another study which looked at olfactory loss versus no olfactory loss, in this case over a 10-year span. And these were people who were in the age range between 40 and 90. People who had olfactory loss in that 10-year span were a 19% higher risk of death in that period than if they maintained a healthy sense of smell. So our sense of smell, not just important from the point of view of basic health, actually without it, we are more likely to die. So that's a very stark and shocking and important statistic to bear in mind. Social relationships are also extremely connected to our sense of smell. The connection between a parent and their child, very much to do with the smell of the child and of the parent and the bonding that takes place within the two there, and maintaining that relationship over a period of years, not just of the person's natural body odor, but also the perfume that they wear, or just the way that, the products that they use, and that feeling of comfort of hugging a parent or hugging a child. And, you smell like home, you smell like what I remember. People who lose their sense of smell often become reclusive and become obsessed with personal hygiene because they don't know if their bodies are giving off some bad odor. So they spend a lot of time showering. They spend a lot of time changing clothes unnecessarily, sort of like throwing out the food that was still good, taking a change of clothes with, going on a trip for 5 hours that they will change their clothes in between because they don't know if they're going to be meeting people, if they'll smell. And like I said, some people actually get to the point where they just give up on social relationships because it's too stressful, both from the level of being able to connect with other people and worrying about themselves, so that they just become reclusive and drop a lot of social relationships, which has a lot of other psychological negative consequences to it. Sexual relationships are also another area that are very much involved in being able to smell for both men and women. And for women in particular, even the ability to orgasm is connected to their ability to smell. So intimacy tends to really become fraught when one member of the couple cannot smell any longer. And there's a lot that has to be worked out to sort of make this work again when there is acquired smell loss. And another thing people don't realize actually is our cognitive capabilities, our analytical skills, our ability to navigate where we are in the world, map read, and know how to go from point A to point B is actually very much connected to our ability to smell, because the hippocampus, which is part of the primary olfactory cortex, is not getting the input that it needs and therefore starting to atrophy and actually malfunction. So people who have high-powered analytical jobs find that they're no longer capable of doing them as well. People find that from the point of view of their spatial capabilities, suddenly they drop off when they lose their sense of smell. Another area which is cognitively related is something referred to as executive functioning. And that's basically your overt capability of looking smart and acting appropriately in the real world, in real time. So that's planning and organizing, regulating your emotions, setting goals, doing the sort of things in daily life, especially job-related daily life, that are really important to succeed. And when the sense of smell is damaged, this becomes highly dysregulated often. And in connection to the idea that we have this input system, we have the sense of smell connecting to the amygdala and the hippocampus. I already mentioned what happens to the hippocampus. The amygdala also bidirectionally connected to the sense of smell you don't have input, and emotion starts to falter, and emotional well-being, depression starts to become more and more of an issue. Now, I should say this is not the case for everybody, and everybody to varying degrees, but it can be to the point of really requiring clinical intervention. And the problem also being that the longer the time goes on without a sense of smell, the worse these things become. So that's, from the point of view of a decreasing capability. Often with other conditions, people learn how to cope and it stays at a steady state, and then they can start to get better. Because the input from the sense of smell is continuously not available, and the related neurological structures, the amygdala and the hippocampus in particular, are continuing not to get proper feedback, this whole loop starts to, continues to malfunction. So memory, as I've alluded to already, is highly connected to our sense of smell, our personal memories, our emotional memories. Without them, we don't have any of those experiences that bring us back in time and place to other moments, and also even to ourselves. This is something which I've done a lot of research on, sort of showing how our experiences of memory triggered by scent really are unique. They are more emotionally engaging and involving and more evocative. They bring us back more to that original time and place than memories triggered by any of our other senses. And sort of that experience of memory and our past writ large, the idea of nostalgia, is very connected to our sense of smell. And nostalgia in and of itself has positive psychological consequences. When people experience nostalgia, their self-esteem improves, their optimism increases, they feel more bonded to other people around them, their sense of self gets better, and their ability to kind of think about where their life goals are actually becomes more available and more positively acted upon. So all of these things connected to being able to smell are lost for people who have olfactory dysfunction. And ultimately, this all wraps up into our sense of self. So there's an enormous alteration, distortion, and difficulty that occurs to our whole sense of who we are when we lose our sense of smell. And this is for people who have acquired anosmia in particular. So just to summarize what I have been telling you about, our sense of smell is critical for our enjoyment of food, our nutrition, our safety. It's vital in our physical health and implies, major consequences for our longevity. It's critically involved in our social and interpersonal relationships. It's involved very much in our ability to think and analyze. Our emotional well-being and our mental health are directly tied to a healthy, functioning sense of smell. Our sense of nostalgia, our past memories, also completely connected to a sense of smell, and ultimately our sense of self. And all of this boils down to our sense of smell really being critical for our overall quality of life. So I just want to leave you with a few take-home messages, which kind of wraps this all up in putting it in perspective. And that is, first of all, the fact that scents are invisible and smell disorders are invisible make it really difficult to communicate the importance of this loss with the world who is osmic. But anosmia and olfactory dysfunction are extremely debilitating. And as we know from the past few years, nasal disease is the number one cause, and is increasing as a function of the fact that COVID is around. And another thing that I should say connected to this is that there have been recent articles written about a concern that because of smell being distorted and lost for so many people as a result of COVID, that the cognitive dysfunction that may follow from this in another 10 years or so, because the brain health is directly affected, is potentially another pandemic. So a healthy sense of smell is critical for our emotional well-being, our physical health, and our brain function. And our sense of smell is fundamentally involved in all facets of our life.